Sarah Yarborough. On December 14, 1991, a 16-year-old honors student drove to Federal Way High School in King County, Washington, around 8 in the morning. She was wearing her drill team uniform, heading to catch a bus to a competition in Kirkland. She arrived roughly 45 minutes early and parked in the back lot. She never made it to that bus. So what happened in that parking lot? And how did it take 28 years and a breakthrough in genetic science to find the person responsible? Sarah Yarborough was an honors student and drill team member at Federal Way High School. Her mother, Laura, called her the delight of my life and the all-American girl next door. Sarah loved art, dance, museums, and dreamed of attending an out-of-state college. She had been looking forward to the drill team competition for weeks. She had everything ahead of her. No one saw her leave her car that morning. A jogger noticed a girl on the ground with a man kneeling over her, but assumed they were a couple and kept running. Around 9:20, two 12-year-old boys cutting through campus saw a white male in a dark trench coat emerge from bushes and walk away briskly. They discovered Sarah's body partially hidden in an embankment near the tennis courts, about 150 to 300 feet from her car. She had been harmed and strangled with her own nylon stockings. Male DNA was recovered from the scene and from under her fingernails, proving she fought back. She did not go quietly. Whatever happened in that parking lot, Sarah resisted with everything she had. Over the next 28 years, detectives pursued more than 4,000 tips and tested 200 to 300 individuals against the full male DNA profile. The profile was routinely run through CODIS and Interpol without a single match. Generation after generation of investigators inherited the file, ran the numbers again, and came up empty. The suspect, it would later be revealed, had evaded detection 3 times through legal loopholes. His 1983 conviction predated CODIS, the national database that should have caught him. A 1993 charge was pleaded down to a misdemeanor that did not require DNA collection, meaning his genetic profile was never entered into the system. And his brother's presence in CODIS could not lead to him because Washington state prohibits familial DNA searching. Every door that should have opened stayed shut. 4,000 tips across nearly 3 decades, and not one of them led to his name. How does someone slip through a net that wide? Then, in 2011, Detective Jim Allen contacted Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick of Identifinders International, making this the first known cold case to use direct-to-consumer DNA data for investigative leads. It was a completely untested approach at the time, a shot in the dark that would eventually reshape how cold cases are investigated across the entire country. YSTR analysis linked the responsible person's paternal line to descendants of Robert Fuller of 1630s Salem, Massachusetts. But the suspect's grandfather had been adopted, changing the surname to Nicholas, and the trail went cold again. The adoption had severed the genealogical chain. It would take another 8 years of waiting. In September 2019, Fitzpatrick's team used autosomal SNP testing on GED match to finally identify brothers Edward and Patrick Nicholas. Undercover detectives followed Patrick to a laundromat in Kent, Washington, and collected discarded cigarette butts from an ashtray after he left. The DNA matched the crime scene profile at odds of 1 in 120 quadrillion. 28 years, and it came down to a cigarette butt in a laundromat. Patrick Leon Nicholas was 27 at the time of the incident and 55 at arrest. He had a devastating criminal history, including 2 convictions at 16, then another in 1983, for which he served only 3.5 of 10 years. He harmed Sarah while on parole. He should not have been free that morning. The system had multiple opportunities to keep him locked up, and every single one of them failed. At his home, police found a torn magazine photo of a woman in a cheerleading outfit and a 1994 newspaper with Sarah's case on the front page. That newspaper was printed 3 years after the incident. He had sought it out. He had kept it. Had he kept it as a trophy? Had he been following the investigation for decades, watching to see if anyone was getting close? Nicholas was arrested on October 2nd, 2019. He was 55 years old, living quietly in Covington, Washington. His trial began April 17th, 2023, in Kent, Washington. On May 10th, the jury found him guilty of first-degree felony. He was sentenced to 548 months, made just over 45 years. Given his age, it is effectively a life sentence. Nicholas appealed. In 2025, the Washington Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction, but remanded for resentencing on a technical issue. He remains behind bars. The case was featured on CBS 48 Hours. But the next case had no DNA technology at all when it happened, and the person responsible was someone the victim's family already knew. Amy Yakimek. On November 6, 1981, a 13-year-old girl in Phoenix, Arizona, was picked up by a neighbor for a party. She was never seen again. Her body has never been found. So how do you solve a case with no body, no crime scene, and no DNA technology, when the prime suspect has been sitting in prison for something else entirely? Amy Marie Yakimek was an 8th grader at Isaac Junior High School in Phoenix. Her younger sister Anita described her as so sweet and so kind to everybody. That evening, around 10:30, neighbor Raymond Diaz, 25, and his girlfriend picked Amy up for a party. Amy woke her 12-year-old sister to invite her along, but Anita declined. It was a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. At the home of Diaz's cousin, Diaz made his intentions toward Amy clear. The cousin refused to allow it, and they left. Amy was never seen again. Later that same night, Diaz appeared at the family's door unclothed, before anyone had even reported Amy missing. That detail alone should have set off alarms. The family came to believe he had already harmed Amy by that point. Amy's grandmother discovered her missing at 6 the next morning and filed a missing persons report. But police initially classified Amy as a runaway, a designation that would cost years of investigative momentum and send a message to the family that their desperation did not matter. Her body has never been recovered, though Diaz later indicated she was buried in a river bottom. To this day, Amy has never been found. Police had recovered blood and hair consistent with Amy's inside the borrowed 1964 Chevrolet that Diaz drove that night. But in 1981, DNA testing simply did not exist. The technology that could have connected Diaz to Amy's blood was still years away from being invented. The physical evidence sat in storage for decades, carefully preserved but completely unusable, waiting for science to catch up to what Amy's family had known from the beginning. In March 2015, 34 years after Amy vanished, standard forensic DNA profiling finally confirmed the blood in the car belonged to her. It was the confirmation the family had waited a lifetime for, the scientific proof that matched what their instincts had told them on the very first night. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office and the Maricopa County Attorney's Cold Case Unit then spent 3 additional years building the case, combining the new DNA confirmation with witness statements gathered over the decades. Every piece of testimony that had been collected since 1981 was pulled back out and re-examined through the lens of the new forensic evidence. Diaz was already serving a lengthy Arizona prison sentence for kidnapping, assault, and burglary from separate offenses committed against other victims. He had continued to harm people long after Amy vanished. He was formally charged with a first-degree taking of life in October 2018 at age 61. He reportedly pleaded guilty in 2021 and is not eligible for parole until 2046, when he would be approximately 89 years old. He will almost certainly spend the rest of his life in prison. But for Amy's family, a guilty plea without a body is an incomplete answer. They know who did it. They know he admitted it. But they still do not know where she is. Amy's body remains unrecovered. Her sister Anita continues to seek the location of her remains, still hoping after more than 4 decades to bring her sister home and give her a proper burial. Diaz has never disclosed the exact location. A girl who was classified as a runaway by the very system that should have been searching for her, whose case sat dormant while her family spent decades knowing exactly who was responsible, but unable to prove it in a court of law. It took 34 years for the science to confirm what Amy's family had known since that night in 1981. Sometimes the hardest part is not finding the answer. It is waiting for the world to believe what you already know. Science eventually caught up to a case from 1981. But the next case had even less to work with. A DNA sample so degraded it was nearly useless. And someone who had been living on the same street the entire time. Julianne Hansen. On July 7, 1972, a 15-year-old girl borrowed her brother's bicycle to ride to his baseball game in Naperville, Illinois. She never returned. So how do you solve a case when both of the victims' parents have passed away, waiting for answers? The DNA is nearly destroyed, and the person responsible has been living quietly for 49 years. Julianne Hansen was a student at Naperville North High School, a band member, choir singer, Sunday school teacher, and neighborhood babysitter. She was the kind of girl every family on the block knew and trusted. The next day, searchers found her body in a cornfield ditch near 87th Street and Modaff Road, then rural Will County farmland. She had been harmed and stabbed 36 times. The case haunted Naperville for 49 years. It was the kind of case that defined a community, that parents whispered about and children grew up hearing. Both of Julie's parents, Jerome and Marguerite, passed away without ever seeing justice. Jerome in 2009, Marguerite in 2019. They spent the remainder of their lives waiting for a phone call that never came. Both went to their graves not knowing who had taken their daughter. Over the decades, investigators tested and eliminated multiple suspects, including convicted offender Major Morris Jr. and serial offender Bruce Lindahl. Every lead faded. The DNA recovered from the crime scene was severely degraded, only 360 picograms, a quantity so small that most labs would have declared it unusable and sent the case back as hopeless. To put that in perspective, a normal forensic sample contains thousands of picograms. This was barely a trace. In a final effort, one last attempt before the case would likely be shelved permanently, Naperville police contacted Identifinders International and Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. After 6 months working with the nearly unusable sample, extracting every possible fragment and amplifying what little remained, the profile was uploaded to GED Match. What happened next stunned everyone involved. Within 2 hours, a relative's match was found. 6 months of painstaking, meticulous lab work, and the genealogical answer came in 120 minutes. It was the fastest resolution in the history of genetic genealogy cold case work. Genealogical research pointed to Barry Lee Welpley, 76, a retired welder living in Mounds View, Minnesota, with no criminal record whatsoever. Not so much as a traffic violation. In 1972, he had lived on the same street, Warley Drive, within a mile of the Hanson home. He had been right there the entire time, close enough to see the search parties, close enough to hear the sirens. Welpley was arrested on June 2nd, 2021, and charged with 3 counts of first-degree and aggravated criminal misconduct. Bail was set at $10 million. However, the case hit a critical legal obstacle. Officers had recorded a private conversation between Welpley and his wife in violation of the Illinois eavesdropping statute, leading a judge to suppress most of his statements. Without those statements, the prosecution's case was significantly weakened. No trial was ever held. On February 9th, 2024, Welpley was found dead in his Will County jail cell at age 79, having apparently passed of natural causes in his sleep. He never stood trial. He never faced a jury. He never had to look Julie's surviving family in the eye. Charges were formally dropped on March 13th. His sister Jill Steininger said, "Barry died sitting in jail, so that's a good thing. I'm happy that it's all over with." 2 hours to find the match. 49 years of waiting. Both parents gone before the name was ever spoken. And then he passed before he ever faced a jury. Was that justice, or just the closest thing to it that Julie's family would ever get? The DNA was nearly destroyed, but it was enough. The next case is different. The DNA was already in the system. The match had already been made, and the people responsible for acting on it simply never did. Hania Aguilar. On November 5th, 2018, a 13-year-old girl stepped outside her home in Lumberton, North Carolina, just before 7 in the morning to warm up her aunt's SUV before school. A man dressed in all black with a yellow bandana forced her into the running vehicle as she screamed and kicked. A neighbor called 911 at 6:58. An Amber Alert was issued at 10. The SUV was found abandoned 3 days later. On November 27th, her body was discovered in a water-filled pit off Wiregrass Road. But here is the part that makes this case unbearable. The DNA that identified her attacker was already in the system. The match had already been made 2 years earlier, and nobody followed up. So how does a girl lose her life because of paperwork? Hania Noelia Aguilar was an 8th grader at Lumberton Junior High with straight A grades, perfect attendance, and dreams of becoming an architect or Marine. Her favorite color was purple, and she played the violin. She was the kind of student teachers remember for years. DNA recovered from the SUV's steering wheel matched Michael Ray McClellan, 34, of Fairmont, North Carolina, whose profile was already in CODIS from prior convictions. McClellan had an extensive history including convictions for assault with a deadly weapon, burglary, and a pattern of harmful acts against women. He was not a stranger to the system. Law enforcement knew his name, knew his record, and had his DNA on file. But here is the critical failure that changed the entire trajectory of this case. In October 2016, 2 full years before Hania was taken, a kit from an unrelated victim had produced a CODIS hit identifying McClellan. The Robeson County Sheriff's Office received the notification. They never followed up. The match sat in a file on someone's desk. No arrest was made, no investigation was launched. No one picked up the phone. D.A. Johnson. Britt stated, "In all likelihood, this gone forward, Hania would not have died." 2 officers were fired or resigned over the failure. 2 years of inaction. That is the gap between a match in a database and a girl who is gone. McClellan was charged with 10 felonies, including first degree. The DA initially sought the maximum penalty. After years of delays caused by pandemic shutdowns, cell phone data processing, and competency evaluations, McClellan pleaded guilty on November 22, 2024, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even on sentencing day, McClellan showed who he was. He made 2 escape attempts during transport, once using a homemade key he had fashioned to free his leg restraints, and again physically grabbing a deputy's firearm before being stopped with pepper spray. The brazenness of the attempts, on the very day he was being sentenced, stunned even veteran law enforcement. He was transferred to Granville Correctional Institution North, Carolina's highest security facility. Hanaya's mother told the court, "It's been very hard, but I have a little bit more peace today." At Hania's funeral, attended by over 900 people, United States Marines served as pallbearers, organized by the community because Hania had dreamed of joining the Marines. The entire town of Lumberton came to a standstill that day. Students from her school wore purple, her favorite color, and lined the streets. Her father in Guatemala was denied a visa to attend his own daughter's funeral. He watched from thousands of miles away while strangers carried his daughter's casket. The DNA was there. The match was there. It had been sitting in a system for 2 years. Someone just did not do their job. And a 13-year-old girl paid the price. The system failed Hania Aguilar in the most preventable way possible. But the next case involves a failure of a different kind. 3 innocent men who spent 18 years in prison for something they did not do, while the real person responsible walked free for 4 decades. Teresa Fusco. On November 10, 1984, a 16-year-old girl clocked out of her part-time job at the Hot Skates roller rink in Lynbrook, Long Island, around 9:45 in the evening. She had just been let go and left in tears. She never arrived at her home 4 blocks away. Her body was found 25 days later in a wooded area near Long Island Railroad tracks, buried under leaves in a wooden pallet. She had been harmed and strangled. But before this case would find its real answer, 3 innocent men would lose 18 years of their lives behind bars for something they did not do. So how did the wrong men go to prison? And how did a smoothie straw finally lead to the right one? Teresa Fusco was 16, a junior at East Rockaway High School in Nassau County, New York, who worked part-time at the roller rink 4 blocks. That is all that separated her job from her front door. She never covered that distance. The case became one of America's most notorious wrongful conviction stories. In 1985 and 86, 3 men, John Kogut, John Restivo, and Dennis Halstead, were convicted based on a coerced confession and fabricated hair evidence. The forensic testimony presented at trial would later be completely discredited, shown to be built on methods that had no scientific basis. They spent approximately 18 years in prison before DNA testing of a previously untested sample conclusively excluded all 3 and revealed an unknown male's DNA. 18 years. Kogut missed the births of nieces and nephews. Restivo and Halstead watched their 20s, 30s, and part of their 40s disappear behind bars for something they had no part in. All 3 were exonerated by 2005. Restivo and Halstead were later awarded $18 million each in a federal civil rights lawsuit. But no amount of money replaces 18 years. 3 families destroyed by a system that valued a quick conviction over the truth. And the real person responsible had been free the entire time, living his life less than a mile away. The unknown male's DNA sat unmatched for years. Nobody in the system matched the profile. In August 2023, Nassau County investigators sent the original evidence to Othram in the Woodlands, Texas. Using forensic-grade genome sequencing, Othram built a comprehensive DNA profile from evidence that was over 40 years old. The FBI's investigative genetic genealogy unit then identified potential relatives through public genealogy databases And the trail led to Richard Bilodeau, who was 23 in 1984 and lived with his grandparents about 1 mile from the roller rink. He had been right there, within walking distance, the entire time. While 3 innocent men sat in prison, Bilodeau lived freely, aging quietly on Long Island, never once drawing the attention of law enforcement. In February 2024, investigators recovered a cup and straw Bilodeau discarded at a tropical smoothie cafe. They had been watching him, waiting for him to leave something behind. The DNA was a 100% match. 41 years of freedom, ended by a straw he tossed in the trash without a second thought. Former neighbors recalled him as a troubled young man and an awkward loner who kept to himself. When investigators approached Bilodeau in July 2025, he said, "Back in the 1980s, you could get away with murder." DA Ann Donnelly's response at his arraignment, "It's 2025 and I got you now." Bilodeau, 63, was arrested on October 14, 2025, and arraigned on 2 counts of second degree. He pleaded not guilty and is being held without bail. As of early 2026, the case remains in pretrial proceedings with no trial date set. Teresa's father, Thomas, now elderly, attended the arraignment clutching her photo. "I only loved her, and I miss her." He had waited 41 years for that moment. Her mother passed away in 2019 without seeing justice, 6 years before the straw was collected. A Hulu documentary, The Last Straw, Solving Teresa Fusco's Murder, was produced about the case. 3 men lost 18 years of their lives for something they had nothing to do with. The real person responsible walked free for 41 years, living a quiet life less than a mile from the scene. And it was a discarded smoothie straw at a cafe that finally changed everything. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. A smoothie straw and 41 years of waiting. But the next case would not even make it to a courtroom, because the person responsible took his own life 10 hours after investigators knocked on his door. Danielle "Danny" Houchins. On September 21, 1996, a 15-year-old girl drove to the Cameron Bridge fishing access site on the Gallatin River in Belgrade, Montana, to clear her head after a family argument. When she did not return, family found her truck unlocked with keys and a water bottle nearby. That evening, searchers discovered her body face down in shallow water in a marshy area under a willow tree, dragged off the main trail. The initial ruling was drowning with manner undetermined. But the forensic evidence told a completely different story. So was this an accident? Or had someone been waiting at the river that day? Danielle "Danny" Houchins was 15 years old, an outdoorsy teenager from Belgrade, Montana. Her younger sister, Stephanie, described her as the kind of older sister that every little sister looks up to. She loved the outdoors, and the river was one of her favorite places to go when she needed space. The autopsy ruled the cause of death as drowning with manner undetermined, a classification that would haunt the investigation for nearly 3 decades. Sheriff Bill Slaughter publicly suggested it could have been accidental. That statement effectively closed the door on any serious investigation before it even began. If the manner was undetermined, there was no confirmed crime. If there was no confirmed crime, there was no urgency to find a suspect. But the evidence from the scene contradicted that entirely. There was evidence of harm in her undergarments, a laceration, bruises on her neck, defensive scratches on her body, and a stomach full of mud. Former Deputy Cindy Botek later challenged the finding. A stomach full of mud. That doesn't happen in a drowning. You do not swallow mud if you are simply submerged in water. You swallow mud when your face is being held down in it. The evidence was there from day one. The classification buried it. For 22 years, the case was effectively shelved, classified as something it was not, while a 15-year-old girl's family lived with the knowledge that the official story did not match what had happened to their daughter. The case was formally reopened in 2019 and gained real momentum in 2023, when retired LAPD Captain Tom Elfmont was brought on as a special deputy. The critical forensic breakthrough came from an unlikely source, one that most investigators would have dismissed as useless. 4 rootless arm hairs recovered from Danny's body were sent to Astria Forensics in California for forensic genome sequencing. Rootless hairs contain no follicle, which means no nuclear DNA, the type of DNA that standard forensic testing relies on. They are extraordinarily difficult to work with, and for most of the history of forensic science, they would have been considered worthless as evidence. But advances in mitochondrial and trace DNA extraction, techniques that did not exist when Danny was found, allow scientists to build a partial profile from those 4 tiny hairs. That profile was then analyzed by C.C. Moore, chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, who connected the DNA to all 4 grandparents of the suspect through distant relatives found in public genealogy databases. The genealogical work was painstaking, tracing family trees branch by branch until they all converged on one person. By May 2024, the suspect was identified: Paul Nathaniel Hutchinson, 55, a Bureau of Land Management fisheries biologist stationed in Dillon, Montana. He had started graduate school at Montana State University the same month Danny was found at the river. He had been in Belgrade at exactly the right time. A fisheries biologist who studied rivers. Found through hairs that had no roots. The science had done what 28 years of traditional investigation could not. On July 23, 2024, investigators approached Hutchinson at his BLM office. During a nearly 2-hour interview, he turned white, displayed extreme nervousness, and denied everything. He was not arrested that day. Investigators let him go, planning to collect further evidence. 10 hours later, at 4:17 in the morning on July 24th, Hutchinson called the sheriff's office saying he needed assistance. Deputies found him dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Post-mortem DNA collection confirmed a 100% match. Sheriff Dan Springer stated, "He confirmed it before we actually got the confirmation when he took his own life." In August 2023, the manner of Danny's passing had been officially changed to homicide. Hutchinson's wife Christy released a statement. "In 24 years of marriage, there was never any hint that something like this could be lurking in the background." 24 years of marriage. 2 decades of sharing a home, raising a life together. And not once did she see anything that made her question who she was living with. That is perhaps the most unsettling part of this case. Not the crime itself, but the fact that someone could carry it for 28 years and never let a single crack show. The case was featured on CBS 48 Hours in February 2025. Investigators are checking Hutchinson's DNA against other unsolved cases in Montana and surrounding states. The question now is whether Danny was the only one. 10 hours between a knock on the door and the end. But the next case stretches back even further, nearly 50 years, and the answer was buried in a cemetery in West Virginia. Sharon Pryor. On March 29, 1975, Easter weekend, a 16-year-old girl left her home in the Pointe Saint-Charles neighborhood of Montreal around 7 in the evening to meet friends at a nearby pizzeria on Wellington Street. She never arrived. 3 days later, her body was found partially unclothed in a vacant lot in Longueuil, Quebec, across the St. Lawrence River. She had been harmed, beaten with multiple facial fractures, and suffocated. White tape and a man's blue t-shirt had been used as restraints. That same night, a 22-year-old woman reported a man matching a similar description attempted to grab her at knife point on the same street. So who was the man on Wellington Street that Easter weekend, and where did he disappear to? Sharon Kim Pryor was 16 years old, a warm-hearted girl from Pointe Saint-Charles who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. For 48 years, Longueuil police investigated 122 suspects without success. 122 names checked, 122 eliminated. DNA evidence was preserved from the scene but was insufficient for testing with the technology available at the time. The case sat cold for decades. One of Quebec's oldest unsolved cases involving a young victim. Sharon's family carried the weight of it through every holiday, every anniversary, every Easter weekend that came and went without answers. The breakthrough came in June 2022, when advances in DNA amplification allowed scientists at Quebec's Legal Science Laboratory, known as LSJML, to develop a complete matching DNA profile from both the t-shirt and jeans recovered at the scene. Y chromosome analysis, the first use of this technique in a Quebec cold case, linked the DNA to a paternal line called Romaine or Romine through an American genealogical database. Genealogists traced the DNA to 4 brothers from West Virginia. 2 living brothers, Noah and Michael Romine, voluntarily provided DNA samples in December 2022. The analysis showed the crime scene DNA was 140 million times more likely to come from their brother than any random person. One brother spontaneously told police that his brother Franklin probably did kill Sharon, and confirmed he was a man with a long history of harming others. Franklin Maywood Roman was a career criminal from Huntington, West Virginia, with a record beginning in childhood. He had escaped prison twice. He had harmed a woman in Parkersburg, West Virginia in 1974. And rather than face the consequences, he fled north across the border to Canada. He was living in Montreal at the time of Sharon's passing, a fugitive from American justice hiding in plain sight in a Canadian city. Captured by Canadian border officials in October 1975, just 7 months after Sharon was found, he was extradited to West Virginia. He eventually pleaded guilty to a serious charge, served minimal time behind bars, and passed away under mysterious circumstances in Verdun, Montreal, in 1982 at age 36. The cause of his passing was never fully explained. He had been dead for over 40 years when his name was finally connected to Sharon. He escaped prison twice, fled to another country, and was never once linked to what happened on Wellington Street until DNA. Technology caught up with him 4 decades after his own passing. On May 2, 2023, Romine's body was exhumed from Pine Grove Cemetery in Putnam County, West Virginia, in a joint operation by Longueuil Police, the FBI, and West Virginia State Police. It was an extraordinary cross-border effort. Canadian detectives standing in a West Virginia graveyard, watching a backhoe lift the remains of a man who had been dead for over 40 years, hoping the bones would confirm what the genealogy had already told them. His DNA was a 100% match. The case was officially closed on May 23, 2023, 48 years after Sharon left for a pizzeria she never reached. Her sister Doreen stated, "Knowing that her killer is no longer on this earth brings us to somewhat of a closure. 48 years of not knowing. 122 suspects investigated and cleared. And the answer had been lying in a cemetery in West Virginia the entire time." Investigators continue checking whether Romine was linked to other unsolved cases in both Canada and the United States. The answer was buried in a West Virginia cemetery the entire time. But the next case is still unfolding because DNA led to an arrest, and then the whole thing fell apart. Dawn Momohara. On Sunday, March 20th, 1977, a 16-year-old girl received a phone call from an unknown male, then told her mother she was going to a shopping center with friends. She never came home. The next morning, police found her body on the second floor of her school's English building. She had been strangled and harmed. A witness reported seeing a man in a maroon and white Pontiac Le Mans near the school that Sunday night. 2 brothers who were graduates of the same school were questioned and released. For 48 years, the case went nowhere. Then DNA changed everything until it didn't. So what happens when science gives you the answer, but the legal system cannot finish the job? Dawn Momohara was 16, a shy but warm sophomore at President William McKinley High School in Honolulu, Hawaii. Detectives had interviewed Gideon Castro and his brother William Castro, both McKinley graduates who knew Dawn from school dances, but could not build a case. DNA profiling did not exist in 1977. The physical evidence was preserved, but without the technology to analyze it, the case went cold. In March 2019, cold case detectives submitted evidence for modern DNA analysis. By May 2020, a partial male DNA profile was obtained from evidence on Dawn's clothing. The sample had survived over 40 years in storage, degraded but not destroyed. In September 2023, familial DNA analysis pointed back to the Castro brothers, the same 2 men who had been questioned in 1977. Detectives traveled to Chicago, where William lived, and covertly obtained DNA from his adult offspring. The FBI excluded William. That left Gideon. Authorities then located Gideon's adult son in Utah. Surreptitious DNA collection from the son confirmed he was the biological offspring of the crime scene DNA donor. The genetic trail was unmistakable. In January 2025, a sample obtained directly from Gideon Castro confirmed the match. 48 years of waiting, and the DNA pointed to a man who had been questioned in the very first week of the investigation. He had been right there from the beginning. Detectives in 1977 had been in the same room with him and did not have the tools to prove it. Gideon Bellamidi Castro, 66, was arrested on January 21, 2025, at a Utah nursing home where he was bedridden with severe sepsis, paralysis, cardiac failure, and dementia. He was in no condition to flee. He was barely in condition to understand what was happening. He was charged with second degree with $250,000 bail. He waived extradition on February 26th. But then the case began to unravel in a way no one anticipated. On March 10th, 2025, Honolulu prosecutors wrote that they could not currently proceed due to complications involving a material witness. The specific nature of those complications has not been publicly disclosed. A Utah judge ordered Castro's release on March 13th. The case was dismissed without prejudice, meaning charges can be refiled if the prosecution resolves its issues. As of early 2026, no public updates indicate refiling. Castro remains legally presumed innocent. The DNA says one thing, the legal system says another. Dawn Momohara's family waited 48 years for an arrest. They watched a man get charged, watched him waive extradition, and then watched the entire case collapse in a matter of weeks. Now they are waiting again, with no timeline and no guarantees. Will the charges ever be refiled? Will the complications with the material witness be resolved? As of today, no one knows. And Dawn's family is left in the same place they have been since 1977. Waiting for something that may or may not come. DNA gave the answer, but the courtroom could not hold it together. The next case is different, because this time there were two suspects, and both of them were already gone before anyone ever knew their names. Pamela Conyers. On October 16, 1970, a 16-year-old girl attended her school's homecoming bonfire in Glen Burnie, Maryland, returned home, then drove her family's 1967 Dodge Monaco to Harrendale Mall to buy shoe polish for the homecoming dance. She never came back. 3 days later, the car was found abandoned in a wooded area near Route 100 construction. Her body was found the next day in a wooded median on Maryland Route 177, clothed but with undergarments and purse missing. She had been strangled and harmed. For over 50 years, nobody was charged. Then DNA identified not one but two suspects, both already deceased. So who were they? And how were two strangers connected to the same scene? Pamela Lynn Conyers was 16, a Glen Burnie high school student who played flute in the school band. She had gone to the mall for shoe polish. That is how ordinary the errand was. She was preparing for a dance, thinking about homecoming, and she never made it home. DNA had been extracted from evidence, including cigarettes found inside her car beginning in 1996. The cigarettes were not Pamela's. Someone had been sitting in her car, smoking, on the night she disappeared. Over the years, investigators explored but ultimately ruled out connections to the cases of Joyce Malecki and sister Catherine Sesnick, the cases featured in Netflix's The Keepers. For a time, detectives believed there could be a link between the three cases. Those leads went nowhere. The cigarettes sat in evidence for decades, their DNA profiles unmatched, waiting for a technology that did not yet exist. In March 2023, the FBI's Baltimore field office used investigative genetic genealogy to identify the first suspect, Forrest Clyde Williams III, a 21-year-old Virginia native described as a drifter and carpenter who attended a different area high school. Williams had minor criminal history and passed away in Salem, Virginia in 2018 at age 69. Then in March 2024, after evidence was sent to Othram for forensic-grade genome sequencing, a second suspect was identified, Donald Willard, a 34-year-old handyman who worked for the contracting company, doing the Route 100 construction near the crime scene. Willard passed away in Montgomery County in 2010 at age 74. Both men's DNA was found on cigarettes inside the victim's car. Two separate suspects, both confirmed through genetic genealogy, both connected to the same vehicle on the same night, more than 50 years ago. Police Chief Amal Awad stated explicitly that both men would have been charged had they been alive. Neither had known connections to Pamela. Neither had any prior relationship with the Conyers family. The exact nature of their relationship to each other, if any, has never been established. Were they working together that night? Did they know each other through the construction site nearby? Did one act and the other simply witness it? Those questions may never be answered. What is known is that two men's DNA ended up in a 16-year-old girl's car on the night she disappeared, and both of them took whatever they knew to the grave. The case remains not officially closed as investigators continue examining both suspects' backgrounds and checking their DNA against other unsolved cases from the era. Pamela's family requested privacy and did not attend either press conference. 52 years, two suspects, and both already in the ground before anyone ever spoke their names. Two suspects identified, both already gone. But the final case on this list carries a similar weight, a name found decades too late, attached to a man who had already taken another life and passed away at 33. Carol Sue Klaber. On June 4, 1976, a 16-year-old girl left her home in Fort Wright, Kentucky, after riding her bike at Devou Park, reportedly heading to eat supper with friends. She was seen getting into a two-tone car driven by a man with sandy blonde hair. The next morning, a dentist found her body in a ditch on Chambers Road in Walton, Boone County. She had been beaten 7 times in the head with a tire iron-type object, strangled with her own chain necklace, and harmed. Her father had passed away in 1970. Her mother, both brothers, and a cousin survived her. For 47 years, nobody was held accountable. So who was the man in the two-tone car, and where did he go? Carol Sue Klaber was 16, a junior at Dixie Heights High School in Fort Wright, in the greater Cincinnati area. She was a gifted musician who started piano at 5 and played violin in the school string ensemble. She had been chosen to perform at the Taft Museum for the Ohio Music Teachers Association, an honor that reflected both her talent and her dedication. She volunteered as a candy striper at local hospitals, was a former Girl Scout, and was described as having a lot of empathy for underprivileged people. She was the kind of teenager who spent her free time helping others. Her father had passed away 6 years earlier. Her mother was raising the family alone. DNA and fingerprints had been preserved from 1976. In 2017, the newly created Boone County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit, led by Detectives Coy Cox and Tim Adams, adopted the case. 2 credible suspects were tested and eliminated. In September 2022, the evidence was sent to Othram Inc., funded by the nonprofit Season of Justice. Othram's forensic-grade genome sequencing and in-house genealogy team identified the suspect in less than 2 months. His name was Thomas W. Dunaway. In February 2023, detectives located Dunaway's daughter. Her DNA showed a 100% parent-child match. The genealogy had led them to the right family. Dunaway was 19 years old at the time, living in Park Hills, Kentucky, the same neighborhood as Carol, about 1.5 miles from her home. He owned a 1973 Chevrolet Monte Carlo, matching the witness description of the two-tone car. 9 days after the body was found, and 1 week after newspaper articles described his vehicle, he enlisted in the United States Army. The timing alone was damning. He left the state within days of seeing his car described in the press. At Fort Carson, Colorado, he immediately traded the Monte Carlo for a different car, erasing the one piece of physical evidence that connected him to the witness description. In December 1976, just months after enlisting, he went AWOL and took the life of 19-year-old Ronald Townsend, who was shot multiple times. Townsend's body was found less than 6 miles from where Carol had been found. The proximity was staggering. 2 victims found within 6 miles of each other, months apart, both linked to the same man. Dunaway confessed to Townsend's case, pleaded guilty, received a life sentence, but was released after approximately 7.5 years. 7.5 years for taking a life. He continued a pattern of harmful criminal behavior after his release until passing away of a heart attack in December 1990 at age 33. He had been free for years. He had harmed others. And he was never once connected to Carol Sue Klaber during his lifetime. Because Dunaway was already deceased, no charges were filed. The Commonwealth's attorney stated that if Dunaway were still alive, there would be sufficient evidence to prove what he did beyond a reasonable doubt. His remains were exhumed and entered into CODIS to check for links to other unsolved cases. Carol's brother Thomas told the New York Times, "I wish I had known in 1990. I had some rather unchristian plans for him." He had waited 47 years. The man responsible had been dead for 33 of them. Sometimes the hardest part is not the waiting. It is finding out the ancestor was already gone, before you even knew to look. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.